So last week, what we looked at is primarily the genre of apocalyptic literature, where we kind of looked at some of the external aspects, especially the world outside of the first century Christianity and the Jewish backdrop, to understand how this particular writing kind of existed. And this way of writing was something which was common to the people out there. And that's why it's commonly called as Jewish apocalyptic writings or Jewish apocalyptic literature and so on. I will continue in the same thought for some more time and then move into the topics for discussion for this week. A few more things that we have to understand, in a literature like this is the fact that it is not future foretold in a serial order or in a chronological order. A lot of times, the way how traditionally the way how it has been interpreted is to look at Revelation like a sequence of events. It's like one after the other. But then a more logical way of putting our thoughts and mind into it and look at this, we'll be able to say that it is not necessarily in a serial or a serial order or a chronological order and so on. Couple of ways in which we can say this is, for example, in Revelation chapter 6, 12 to 17 is where we can find the sixth seal. And the sixth seal, there is a picture of like the parousia, the coming or the destruction and so on. The idea that end has already come. But then it is only chapter 6 then. There is still another many more chapters or talking about judgment, many more chapters talking about punishment, righteousness, and all of these aspects that is still existing in the book. Another example to this is in Revelation chapter 8, 7, it says that all the green grass is burned. But then when you look at Revelation 9, 4, it says don't harm the grass or don't, the grass is not harmed. So a kind of getting a contradicting picture out there. So that's why we have to kind of be a little careful how we interpret this, because most of it is not to be interpreted in a manner that in a manner which is chronological or sequential as we can see it. Another thing about Revelation is about the literary should we interpret it in a more literal manner or symbolic manner. Now, yes, there are clear literary and literal aspect of Revelation, right? But then also there are a lot of symbolic way of expression. And that's why most of Revelation is not to be treated in a literal manner. Now, we know that there are various expressions used in Revelation and so on. It talks about the pillar in the temple. Revelation 3:12 talks about the pillar in temple and so on. But then later we say in Revelation 21 that there is no temple and so on. So if you're going to take everything literally, there is a kind of a problem at it. Dr. Jacob uses an example which is very interesting. He says in Revelation chapter 1, 14, when you study 14 to 17, we can find that the seven stars is in the right hand of the Son of Man, right? Verse 16 will tell us that the seven stars is in the right hand of the Son of Man. And then in verse 17, it says, then he laid his right hand on me. So if we are going to take it literally, then the problem is where is the stars right now? Because in verse 16 it says that the seven stars is in the right hand of the Son of Man. And then verse 17 says he laid this right hand on me. Now, though the expression is used in this way, it is not meaning in a literal manner, right? Each of this is symbolizing a meaning. Each of it is looking at in a certain way and so on. In fact, even when we read it, we understand it, isn't it? The sword of Jesus's mouth, Revelation 8, 6 to 11. It's definitely not talking about, a sword in his mouth and so on. It's largely talking about like a judgment passage and so on. And that's why we have to kind of get a understanding. Where do we understand or where do we interpret Revelation in a literal manner and where we look at it in a symbolic manner? And largely, a good part of Revelation is trying to let us or help us to understand things in a literal or not literal manner. Another thing about Revelation, which is very significant, and we will see this from chapter 1 until the end of the writing, is the fact that there is a repetition of picture and number patterns. Right? You can kind of see there is a perspective in numbers that we can find over here. For example, the number 7, right? The number 7. Now, if you look at it, Revelation from the beginning is attributing the number 7 to something which is a whole, a completeness, or a divine perfectness, and so on. We can see that the letters to the churches were to 7 churches. Now, even today afternoon, I was reading a writing by a very profound scholar, and he was saying that it is may not even be 7 churches. There might be a plentiful number of churches, but the way how the author is portraying it is in a perspective of 7 churches to show the wholeness of this perspective, to show that, okay, this is how the wholeness aspect that can come over there. 7 seals that is going to come from chapter 5:1 onwards. It is about the complete unfolding of God's plan, the divine judgment, and so on. The 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls, the 7 spirit, and all of these are representations or are 7 that we can find over there. The number 12, some way or the other, expressing the people of God. Right. And so there are various pictures, there are various numbers that we can see. To some extent, the number 6, especially with Revelation 13:18 and the whole 666 coming and so on, to show some sort of a human rebellion, the human standing, an Adamic nature sort of a thing as we can see it. The number 1,000, right? We can find in Revelation 20 like a 1,000-year period, right? Now, somehow, what is it trying to express? So these numbers have some sort of symbolic significance as such. Now, the tricky part here is, if we are going to find everything bits and pieces like this, take a number and say this is that, this is that, sometimes we will struggle to affirm it with other text, right? And hence, whatever has a repetitive pattern, whatever has a continuous way in which the author is more clearer in saying something, those are things which we can kind of take. For example, the number 12, throughout from the New Testament, we can find that number pattern is repeating, like 12. To some extent, Jesus choosing 12 disciples, and some way or the other it links to the 12 tribes, and then we can see in Revelation the people of God being represented, the 24 elders, again connected with the number 12 to some extent, and all of those representations we are able to find. So I would say, just because we find a number, we should not confuse it or affirm it to be a certain thing. I think we should look for repetitive patterns, repetitive and clearer patterns, which will give us an understanding of what those numerical representations are as such. Now, when we talk about Revelation, we have already discussed the blend that it includes of apocalyptic nature, but it includes 3 literary types. Now, what is a genre? A genre is basically a type of writing. It's about how do we understand this writing. Now, just for an easy reference, a book like, or a writing, a letter like Galatians or Ephesians or First Peter, they're all epistles or letters that are written. That had a letter writing formula, and it had, in the modern times when we interpret it in a way how a letter is going to be read and so on. The other way of looking at Revelation, now I'm going to go to each of this, is it is a prophecy as such. So let us start with prophecy. Now, Apocalypse we have discussed in depth in the last class and this session till now. But now let us look into the whole blend of it being a prophecy. Now, John here is standing in the line of prophets. Interestingly, if he is John the Apostle writing it, that's the claim that most people take to be who is the author of the book of Revelations. Most people say it is John the Apostle. But not even once we get a picture of John carrying an apostolic authority in the letter. Instead, we get John to be in a more prophetic category, right? Or establishing or standing himself with the prophets of the Old Testament tradition and so on. Or to some extent, there are scholars who argue that he writes in such a way that he is like the climax of the Hebrew prophets, or the final in line, who is writing to kind of show, okay, the whole ancient promises that has been spoken by all the prophets have now been fulfilled in Jesus the Messiah. And hence, John is probably going to be that final established prophet of the Holy Scriptures. So we can find, to some extent, a perspective that makes us understand that John is not standing in line of an apostleship here, but as a prophet. Now, there might be a reason why he is doing this, right? Because who are actually prophets? We're going to look at that. So, what is he doing is, he, knowing that Jesus has established the kingdom and that the end is near, right? And the end is near, he is writing this as a prophecy. He's writing this for the people of God. And what is he writing? He says, John is calling this book as a prophecy in a couple of places. 1:3, and later in 22, 18, 19, and so on. So what is this? He says that this is a testimony about Jesus for which the churches are suffering and is a spirit of prophecy. To some extent, we can find that John is carrying this or making it understand like a prophecy. Now, the difficulty here is, who is a modern prophet? A modern prophet is somebody who predicts future correctly. That's, we say, who's the right prophet? Somebody who can predict the future in a correct manner. Somebody who can say what's going to happen to me in the next 6 months, and they are today's prophets. But not necessarily that's the way how the Old Testament prophetic system worked. Because most of them were not foretellers who were predicting the future, but rather forthtelling, looking and prophesying into the present of their life to turn back into the covenant that God has established with his people. So here, John is using that authority, standing in the lineage of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and many other psalmists, where he uses their language. Now, this is another reason why we say he is more prophetic in his writing, because he uses these words like eating of scrolls, Ezekiel, the throne room commissioning, and all to kind of establish his authority. Now, we have already stated in last class that John, who's writing this, is definitely somebody who is very well versed with the Old Testament scriptures. Now, when we say Old Testament scripture, please understand that it's Old Testament only for us. It is definitely their testament, right? Their covenantal testament. They were preaching from that. They were being encouraged from that, and so on. Now, when we say John was establishing him in the line of prophets, the whole understanding was this prophecy was meant to be kept. So just like Jeremiah stood outside the temple and wept looking at the situation of Jerusalem, here is John standing there encouraging people to take the gospel to their heart, right? There is a current crisis that is happening. There is an issue that's happening. So John is encouraging them, stand firm, hold the doctrines that they have received and take it in that manner. So John clearly intends this apocalypse to be a prophetic word to the church. His book was not to be sealed for the future. Now, please understand, this book is going to go into the first century audience. So this is not a magic tool that 20 centuries later somebody can come and unlock. This is not that. This is basically, John is giving this, what was hidden, he's revealing it to the people, And this is going to help them in their present situation. And hence, to simply answer who is a prophet, a good biblical response has nothing to do with looking to the future and predicting something to the future. But who is a good biblical prophet is to say that he is a covenant enforcer, or he is a covenantal, somebody who takes people back to the covenant. That is why often prophets are not going to tell anything new. The prophets are mostly going to go back and repeat what is already stated in the law. Because the prophets are not inventing anything new, but rather they are covenant enforcers. They are enforcing that the people of God, the ones who are part of this covenant, will remain part of this covenant forever. So that is kind of the perspective that we get about prophecy. So John, what is he doing as a prophet? Wanting the people to remain in Christ. Why? We will look at it in a few minutes. Now, we looked at Revelation as an apocalyptic writing, and we also looked at Revelation as a prophecy. But please keep in mind, not the prophecy how we look at it in the modern times, but more of as a covenantal enforcer, somebody who keeps people, guards the people in the covenant. The third way to look at the genre of Revelation is to look at it as an epistle. As an epistle. Now, what do you mean by an epistle? Now, somebody is writing a letter to a person, and that person is supposed to take that letter and read it and understand what the other person is telling. Now, most often, the people whom we are writing to, they know some things about us, we know some things about them, and when we are corresponding with each other, there is a lot of mutuality in it. But when a third person comes into this discussion, most often they are not aware of what we are talking about. So the struggle is, I know and you know what we are talking about, but the person who's coming in between doesn't understand what we are talking about. The struggle with any letters, take any letters of the New Testament, the struggle which we have to understand is because there is another party on another side whose voice is completely hidden for us. We are only hearing Paul shouting at Galatians. We are not able to hear what people at Galatia is actually telling. Same thing. Paul is writing multiple letters to the Corinthian church. We are able to read Paul's words. In fact, even in that Paul's words, there are some letters that are lost. But what we have is some words of Paul to Corinth. But we don't have the church writing back to Paul. That is not available to any of us. So the struggle with letter is most often we are hearing only from one side. The other thing about letter is letter comes with an occasion. The occasional background is the core of interpreting any letters. May it be Galatians, Ephesians, and Revelation. That means there is a reason why they are writing these letters. So there is a statement, and that's why most often we call this the theology in the epistles as task theology. That means to make or do a particular task, or to get some things done, or to get something sorted, Paul would suggest certain things for the church to do. Now, if you don't understand the occasion of the church, we will think it is going to be a universal application that Paul wants everywhere people to follow that same custom-made, advice or doctrine or whatever it is. So there is an occasionality or a task-oriented nature to the letters. So when we look at Revelation as a letter, obviously it's a slight different from Galatians or Romans, because this is not just letter. This has other genre also intertwined into it. But when we look at it, we see that as it's a combination of apocalyptic and prophetic, but it is coming in the form of a letter. So here is John writing an apocalyptic styled letter, but very prophetic, very covenant enforcing matter. But how is he doing it? In the format of a letter. And we see the opening formula in the initial verses 4 to 7 and the closing formula of a letter writing of the Greco-Roman context is very much evident in this letter. So opening and closing of letter to some extent is evident in this letter. Now, some of the, just for if you're interested, some of the letters that we consider to be letters do not necessarily have this pattern. For example, Hebrews. We usually call as the epistle to Hebrews or the epistle of Hebrews. Now, Hebrews do not have an opening which is the format of a letter writing. Obviously, it has a closing of a letter writing. Some personal remark and a final conclusion, final greeting is there. But opening, no opening of a letter writing. So there are different ways of writing in a letter format, an epistle format, as we can see it. Now, another interesting thing that we can find here is John often speaks to his readers in first or second person. So I-you language is very common in Revelation. We find John telling about I, you. So this also shows the familiarity of John, the person who's writing the letter, along with the people who are reading the letter. So as he's sending this letter, right, we have to understand it. And the more we study this, what we kind of understand is Revelation 2 and 3 have a set of individual instruction to churches. And most of us, what we know actually from Revelation are those parts. And that's fantastic, actually. Now, Revelation 2 and 3 mentions about 7 churches. Why not 8? Why not 6? As I mentioned before, the number 7 carries some sort of a perspective, a wholeness, a completeness, and so on. Now, the whole way of looking at this for many people is, it is not necessarily 7 churches. There are plentiful churches in the region of Asia Minor. Now, please understand, even when we say this is a letter to the church at Ephesus or the church at Smyrna, it is not one church that they are talking about. The reason being, unlike modern world where we have place where 100, 150, 200 can gather, in the first century context, where did they gather? They gathered in homes which can accommodate 30, 40 people. Even in a very huge house, you can accommodate a maximum of, let's say, 50 people. But the church was multiplying in the first century context, isn't it? And hence, there were plenty of churches. It was not just one church, but to some extent, there was like a bishop or elder who was able to look forward to many of these, or caretakers of many. And that's why we can find from the very early church history onwards, we can find the division of leadership structure itself. Right? We can see deacons, we can see elders, we can see bishop or superintendent, sort of in the modern world. The idea is there might be local leaders, there might be more leaders, and then there will be somebody. So John, we often call John as a bishop at Ephesus, and so on. And later we find other biblical characters taking that form, where they served as a bishop to many, many churches, not as formal as how it is today in our denominations and so on, but more in a casual, informal way, but very structured in itself. Now, why did I say that? The reason John is writing this 7, now don't think that John is ending Ephesus with just that few verses in chapter 2. Yes, in chapters 2 and 3, he addresses individual issues to the churches. But then, chapter 4 onwards is a common letter he's writing to everybody. So, yes, individual references are there in 2 and 3, but from chapter 4 onwards, it is going to be a common letter that is going to be a instruction, imperative, what they have to do throughout the churches. So what we get here is the understanding that this is a letter he is writing to these 7 churches. Now, the significance of this is that, as with all the epistles, there is an occasional aspect to revelation. We're going to come to what might be the occasion of revelation. It was occasioned at least in part by the needs of the specific church to which it is addressed. Therefore, to interpret it, we must try to understand the original historical context. So, to study Revelation, context is a key word. In fact, to study the whole Bible, context is a key word that we can study. So, how do we understand this? If I have to summarize the genre, the three types of genre, the type of writing, this is one way to easily put it. We can say that it's a first-person narrative of a vision. So here is a seer, a prophet, who's seeing a vision, in an apocalyptic manner that acts as a proclamation from God. So here is a prophet who's receiving the message from God, right? And he's receiving it in a first-person way, right? Here is God who is giving the divine angels. God is giving him the message, and he is going to proclaim this out to people. But this is addressed to specific historical churches in crisis. So this is where there is a universality to this message and there is a historicity to this message. That means, yes, revelation is for everyone everywhere, but revelation is rooted in a specific historical context as such. Let me move ahead to what are some of the approaches to reading Revelation. Approaches to reading Revelation. Now, I'm doing this primarily to make us understand that not everyone will agree with your or my way of interpretation, or you can have a different interpretation from what I'm having. Historically, churches have had different interpretation towards Revelation. And let me say one thing, right? We can argue about this, we can fight about this, and people have conducted debates and tried to solve this historically, trying to come to peace of what is the right. But the truth is, there is some element of standing for almost all of these methods, except maybe for one of it. And hence, the modern scholarship also tends to give a slight different approach also, which I tend to bring in. So the first one and the most common one, especially in many of our settings, is a futurist approach of revelation. Now, in the futurist approach of revelation, most often, now just like how the word suggests, they directly look at revelation with respect to the future. So everything about revelation is something about a distant future. So between the first coming, or most often they say, after revelation is being written, to the coming of Christ is what revelation is ultimately all about. Now, most often what they look at is the seal, the trumpets, the judgments, and all in connection with something that is going to happen with the future, right? So this is more to do with the way how revelation is looked at as a futuristic matter. For them, revelation has a lot to do with the literal reading. So they read a lot of things in revelation in a very literal way. This leaves very little room for symbolism. So for them, revelation is not symbolism. That's why I have had friends who take study on revelation who have said, as much as possible, read revelation literally. That means if it is mentioning Jesus having a sword, please try to take it literally. Kind of getting the picture that you have to maximum, as much as you can take things literally, take it in a literal manner. The struggle also to this is, how is the first century context related in this matter? Imagine you and I are going through a problem and somebody is giving us a solution, right? And then that person is telling, but don't worry, you will not understand it. Neither will your children understand it. Neither will their children understand it. But 21 centuries later, in some universities of the world, some people will try to diagnose this letter and they will try to make sense of this letter at that point of time. will it convey any form of comfort or hope to any of us? The answer is no. If this was written to the first century context, this had significant impact for the first century believers also. So that is why now, please hold on to this until I finish this whole section, then only you will understand where I'm heading this to. Does Revelation have futurist matters? Absolutely. There are a lot of things in Revelation which is futuristic in its nature. However, is everything in Revelation futurist? The simple answer is not necessary. Now, some of you might enjoy this, but let me quickly do it for all of you. There are different ways of reading even futurist approach. The first approach, which is the most common approach, is a dispensational premillennialism. Now, when we come to Revelation 20, I intend to again show this with a chart. But for now, what is dispensational premillennialism? This is an interpretation that says that Christ is going to have two comings. He will have a secret coming, and then along with the church, there is going to be a public coming of the Lord, and so on. So this is obviously, as I mentioned, it's a more literalistic interpretation of Revelation. And there is two people of God. In this way of looking at it, there is Jews and Christians. And Jews have a slightly different way of dealing with it, and so on. So many dispensationalists kind of look at Revelation 1 to 3 being about church, and then 4 to 20 largely being about the Jewish people, or some say from 6 to 20 about Jews, and finally Revelation 21, 22 for both Jews and Christians, and so on. They also believe in a literal 1,000-year period. So that means Christ will come along with his people and reign for literal 1,000 years. That's another understanding. So New Jerusalem comes after the millennium for a dispensational premillennialist. The second opinion to this is something called as historical premillennialism. Now, this is one of the most accepted forms of reading in many circles today. Historic premillennialism. What is historic premillennialism? Now, here is a scholar, a wonderful scholar who has worked a lot on the idea of kingdom of God called George Eldon Ladd. Now, he has said, or he has brought out this understanding that Revelation has to be understood in a symbolic manner. So this is more looking at it in a symbolic way, yet there is a lot of this is more futuristic in its manner than the present time. So how is it different from the other approaches? Is to say that it is symbolic, yet it looks a lot towards the future. And then there are no two people of God. There is only one people of God. There is no differentiation between Jews and Christians, but they are largely one group of people who are believers of Christ Jesus. Now, most often, historical premillennialists also suggest of a single coming of the Lord. They don't look at it as two different comings, but a single coming of the Lord. The third futurist. Now, I know this is going a lot, but hold on with me for this week also, as we are still debating over the issues at Revelation that scholars look at. Amillennialism. Now, millennialism is believing in a literal 1,000 years. So, amillennialism, just like theist and atheist, right? They don't believe in a millennium. For them, it is more of the understanding is that it is a church age. That means today we are living in the so-called millennium. So it's a symbolic understanding between Jesus's ascension till the coming of the Son of Man again. That is what they understand to be a millennial period of time. So amillennialism, they don't believe in a literal 1,000-year period, but rather they look at it more like a church age at this point of time, and so on. So futurist approach, largely they'll try to read Revelation as much as literal as possible, look at it majority towards the future, And most often, they focus a lot on whatever is happening in the world. So a war comes, they're interested. A political situation comes, they're interested. Your stock market is crashing, they're interested. One currency for the whole world, one language for the whole world, vaccine coming, they're interested. So somewhere or the other, they are, constantly trying to track what is happening in the world. Second approach, preterist approach. Preterist approach. Now, what is a preterist approach? Preterist approach is an approach which kind of say that everything in Revelation is a historical event. So they are the other extremes towards this. Now they say the author is keeping the geographical, political, the social, the religious background of the first century Mediterranean world, and is trying to talk theology to the people of the first century. And so almost everything is fulfilled in the first century itself. Some scholars go up to a position where they say Revelation was written even before the temple destruction, and a lot of this is fulfilled in the temple destructions also. Now, even this, there are two opinions. One, the common preterist, or somebody who believes in what is already told, saying that everything is fulfilled in the first century, second century history. The second opinion is something called as partial preterism. Partial preterism. The partial preterism is an understanding of a lot of revelation is fulfilled in the first century context, yet there are some to be fulfilled in the near future. That means partial preterists kind of argue that there are some aspect of revelation or a good number of revelation is fulfilled in the first century context, yet the final culmination is yet to happen. So that is a second view that we can understand. The third one is a historist approach. A historist approach. Now, a historist approach, they are not necessarily interested in the first century context, but they are more interested in looking at certain specific events happening throughout history until the present day. So they are trying to interpret Revelation by kind of predicting events that are happening from one generation to the other generation and so on. So here again, they analyze the social, political, religious factors and different times and look at it, how it has apocalyptic expectation in the early Christian communities and so on. Now, historist is one of those views that are largely kind of disregarded, especially because there's a lot of predictions, assumptions. People tend to look at some events as the biggest downfall, and then the society develops and they come back, and then later they will look at something else and they will say that is this particular prediction and so on. Now that, and hence that approach is not very accepted by many people across. The fourth one, which is a wonderful way of looking at Revelation, is something called as idealist approach. An idealist approach. Now, what is an idealist approach? An idealist approach is something that focuses more on the theology of the text than when did it or where will it happen and things like that. For them, they value the historical context, which is the first century context, the Jewish apocalyptic literary styles and writings and all of those things. But they are not interested in the fulfillment aspect. They are not looking to see, okay, this is when it is going to be fulfilled or that is when it is going to be fulfilled. Rather, they are more interested in the theology of the book. And hence, they are more focused on the ongoing struggle between the good and evil, or the triumph of Christ over the forces of darkness and so on. And hence, Revelation becomes a timeless book. An idealist approach because it focuses on the theology, Revelation becomes a timeless book. That means it is as relevant today to the first century. The first century person reading the book, it's relevant to him. And today's, if somebody reads the book, it is relevant to them also. But that is why there is some way of combining some of these approaches together, where some scholars call this as an eclectic approach. An eclectic approach. What is an eclectic approach? Where they are combining mainly three of this. So they focus on the first century application like the preterist, meaning they focus on how the first century context was so relevant in the discussion of studying Revelation, and then looking at the principles or theology like the idealist, and finally recognizing some future elements like the futurist. So this is probably the way how we are going to look at Revelation. So we will try to pay close attention to the historical context. We will try to grasp the principle or theology that each text is driving to us. And thirdly, we will see where the culmination is going to be and how the culmination is going to be. I like this quote from a brilliant New Testament scholar called as Raymond Brown. He says this, and I think this should be in our mind as we go forward. Many believing Christians do not think that the author knew the future in any sense beyond an absolute conviction that God would triumph by saving those who remain loyal by defeating the forces of evil. John probably did not know what was going to happen throughout generations. John could not predict on what is going to happen when and where, and is it going to be this war and that war and so on. But there was one thing that the author was so convicted about. That is that God, because he has defeated the evil, the Lord is going to reign and he is going to triumph. And along with him, the ones who were loyal, the ones whom were marked by the blood of the Lamb, they will remain to be with the Lord. And they will remain victorious. So Revelation is not tracing historical markers from one generation to the other, but rather ultimately knowing that ultimately over everything, there is God's reign. So it is relevant in first century. It is reigning over the Domitian. It was reigning over Constantine. It was reigning over every societal history, including today. That's our understanding of Revelation. Hence, let us now slowly move into the letter itself. I'm going to quickly do some things of historical things, which might be of some help to our understanding, and then we will close for today. Who is the author? Two opinions that we can see. One, as mentioned, the common opinion is that it is John the Apostle. Sorry about the slide, some issue with formatting. John the Apostle. Traditionally, many believe that he is the son of Zebedee, the disciple of Jesus, and the author of the fourth gospel and the Johannine epistles. So some scholars argue it is to be John the Apostle, which is still valued by many times. Now, 4 times his name we can find in the gospel. We can find it in Revelation. Now, the difference between John the Gospel and Revelation is the fact that in John the Gospel, he doesn't even name himself once. He hides behind a title, the disciple whom Jesus loved. But if it is John the Apostle, he is using his name 4 times, 1:1, 1:4, 1:9, and 22:8. 4 times he is using this name. But we have to understand, John, like how it is today, it's also a very, very common name of the first century context. People who were coming from the exiles and so on, John was a very, very common name that was out there. Early church largely ascribed John the Apostle to the authorship of Revelation, largely. However, scholars also suggested different elder John, whom they call as John the Elder. Some opinion is that he was an elder who was to some extent had to defend his authority because he was a peer to the churches that he addressed. He was here to defend his authority and he was writing. Now, our understanding is apostolicity is very important in the canonical aspect. Yet, authorship is not our criteria of inspiration, right? We are not necessarily going to die upon the authorship over here. Both the opinions stands valid and both the opinions has its own strength. Now, the clearer aspect to here is the fact of the audience. The audience is definitely the 7 churches to the ancient Roman province of Asia. You can see it in the map in front of you. Now, this is very commonly seen in your chapters 2 and 3 also. Now, the way how each of the churches is written also is like a postman route, right? From one church to the other church, the order which is there is according to their geographical location. If somebody is going to, postman is going to travel from one place to the other, he is probably going to follow that same order. So these 7 churches, but as I mentioned before, this is probably a numerical representation to tell that writing this letter to many, many churches in different regions of Asia Minor. That's what we can find it. The common datings. Again, 2 opinions. Somewhere or the other, Christian scholars want to give more than one opinion everywhere. So commonly 2 opinions. One, a Nero dating, right? Some scholars would like to give a Nero dating. Now, Nero dating is somewhere around 60s, right? Where they kind of say that this book or this letter was written during the persecution of Nero. But the most common one is a Domitian dating. The Domitian was an early Roman Empire from 95 to 96 and so on. And most probably that was a time when this was written. So commonly when somebody asks, we say 90s. That's an easy way of telling. But because we have a little more clearer proof of something like 95, 96 might be a preferable dating to Revelation as we can see it. A Domitian ruling over there. So Domitian was likely the emperor during that time when Revelation was written. And Domitian expelled astrologers from Rome and also repressed monotheists there, such as Jews and Christians. So Domitian was a very peculiar emperor, and he was very, somebody who was enforcing himself upon people as an emperor who can be worshipped and so on. We're going to come to that understanding in some time. Like the earlier emperors, like Caligula, Nero, Domitian also wanted to be worshipped when he was alive, reportedly with the title Lord and God. And today, we have coins with this inscription, Theo Curio, and so on, right? Lord and God. Today, we have those things available to us with Domitian's picture and so on. So persecution was definitely one of the significant contexts that we can find here. But the way how Rome used to rule was something called as Pax Romana, Roman peace, peace of Rome and so on. So Rome believed that give people all what they can and finally take all what they have. So basically, they will do all the developments, construct such huge theaters, buildings, spend money, effort on so many of things. And ultimately, who will pay for all this? It will come from the poor people who are working on a daily wage matter. But the way how it was put out was there should be a profound debt of gratitude towards the state. That means, to some extent, everybody is owing to the state. So high taxes and all were implemented out there. Along with that, we have something called as emperor cult or emperor worship. Emperor cult or emperor worship. Now, what do you mean by emperor worship? Emperor worship is basically Rome believed that it was chosen by the gods to rule, and hence the emperor was viewed as the agent of God's will. So, some of them, it was earlier in a structure called apotheosis, which meant the emperor as God over the time. That means most often after their death, they were viewed as emperors, as gods. But with Caligula, Nero, Domitian, they believed that they were God's agents when they were alive, and hence they have become gods when they were alive itself. So I hope you're reading to the times. The political context of the times was a point when an emperor wanted his people to worship him. The emperor wanted his people to kind of bow down before him and worship him, pay money to him, and so on. There were two responses from the church. Two responses. One, resistance. Some were not ready to bow down before the ruler. Some were not ready to call Caesar as Lord and God. And hence, for Christians, participation in Roman cultic life was seen as a violation of the Lordship of Christ, isn't it? Because they have to worship the emperor, and hence it will be a violation of what they are standing for and what they believe in. Now, if they are not going to do that, they are going to be chased out of the community. They will not have money, as well as persecution was of effect. Now, in Revelation, by name, we have one person, which is Antipas, right? The one who has been martyred. So, by name, we have one. So, we can understand that to some extent, there are people who are ready to resist and die for the case of their faith. But just like everywhere, there is a second group who are ready to compromise and having an attitude of complacency, right? Now, for them, they are ready to some extent compromise. Now, they don't want to leave Jesus because some way Jesus has touched their life, and Rome will allow that as long as you're worshiping the emperor also. So, people or some were compromising. So, what is happening? Rome is a corrupt, godless, violent system that sets itself as God. Rome is standing in the picture in the form of a god. John is going to challenge them in two ways. One in the form of a warning, and the other in the form of a comfort. Where is it a comfort? Telling them to persevere because Christ has the ultimate reign. But on the other hand, there is a warning to wake up and repent before they also share in Rome's judgment. So the message is that Rome is ultimately going to be judged and they will fall and they will completely be destroyed. So the message over here is, if you have to be saved, repent and turn back to God. So what a wonderful challenge we can find here. On one side, comforting, or you can see a motherly perspective here where the mother want to embrace, and you can also see that fatherly perspective where you can see that father correcting, sharpening, rebuking, disciplining, and so on. So Revelation has both these matters. Friends, I know we have taken some time to look at the context, at the background, the ways to interpret Revelation and so on. This is important because as we move ahead, we will be looking at how will certain groups interpret this and so on. But ultimately, the study of this should help us in these two ways. One, to be comforted knowing that the Lord is on the throne. He is reigning. Second, if there is any sense of complacency, any sense of space where we are compromising, Revelation challenges us to stand firm in the truth.